Thank you very much for the kind invitation to say a few words about climate change and what I call climate realism. I suspect that you, like me, care a lot about climate change, understand just what a threat it is to us humans throughout the world, and want to do something about it. I suspect too that you, like me, care a lot about our local environment, about our landscapes, about our biodiversity, about the depletion of nature, about the state of our rivers, and want to do something about that too. And then finally, I suspect, like me, you feel torn because quite a lot of the things people want to do about climate change are things which are actually going to do quite a lot of damage to our natural environment, to our landscapes, to everything that's special, precious, and biodiverse about our own particular patch. And there's no doubt whatsoever, we are on the cusp of a major spate of industrialization, particularly industrialization of the countryside on a scale that we've not seen for a very long time. And quite a lot of that is in the name of climate change. And actually, quite a lot of it that's in the name of climate change is not only going to damage our landscapes and biodiversity, but also not going to do anything about climate change either. So let me explain how we should think about climate change, why our current policies are not really achieving very much, and in some cases doing some harm, and make some remarks about where we should be paying our attention. So let me state the obvious, and it is obvious, but it's much neglected. Climate change is about the concentration of carbon and the other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Increase that concentration, parts per million, then other things being equal, we'll get hotter. We were in the pre-industrial revolution at about 275 parts per million. We're now on 224, 226, pushing to 430. So I should say 430 and 424, not the slip of the tongue to 2. You can see how the order of these magnitudes catches one out. But suffice it to say, we've been adding 2 parts per million every single year since 1990, when the targets are supposed to have started. And last year we added 3. There isn't a single blip in the increase in the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere since 1990. You can't see a blip for COVID, despite the clampdown on the lockdowns, etc. And you can't see a blip for the financial crisis back in 2007, 2008. You might think, well, how could that be? How could we have the greatest experiment in emissions reduction, COVID, and it not make any difference? How could we have a major economic shock and it not make any difference? Well, the answer again is pretty obvious. It is that the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere is the net of 2 numbers: emissions, yes, and sequestration. Our particular concentration of carbon is the balance between those 2 things. And think about it. What have we been doing? Well, we've piled on with the emissions, especially China. China is 56% of all coal burnt in the world. Just think about that. And 32, 33% of total emissions coming from virtually nothing back in 1990. So these have continued to go on up with some blips. But at the same time, we have been destroying the ability of nature to suck up carbon. Those pictures of the Amazon burning is not just emitting lots of carbon from the Amazon. Bits of the Amazon are now net emitters of carbon, but it's also making it impossible for those areas to do any more sequestration in the future. And we have been destroying our rainforests at an alarming rate. I read just recently, I think it was in the Financial Times, that the Indonesian government has sent in the army to speed up the clearing of the rainforests for the planting of modern agriculture. This is devastating stuff. And all the mining that we're now engaged in globally to produce all those critical minerals and rare earths for the so-called low carbon technologies, well, that's just making it pretty bad too. So what we've been doing is increasing emissions, reducing the ability to sequestrate, and adding more carbon to the atmosphere. So have that in mind. We have to make a dent in the increase in parts per million in the atmosphere. And we're not. So anyone who believes more of the same, what we're currently doing, is going to crack the problem. Good luck. And remember, it's global. It's not Oxford warming. It's not English warming. It's global warming. It doesn't matter where a ton of carbon is emitted or where it's sequestrated. And some areas are increasing their emissions very fast and some aren't. And in some areas, it's relatively cheap to cut down on the emissions. And in other areas, it's relatively expensive. So a country like the UK is what? Less than 1% of total global emissions, probably about 0.8, but responsible for a lot more. Why? Well, what we've been doing is getting down our emissions by essentially closing down quite a lot of our energy intensive industries. And so what we do is we pretend that we're doing really well because our emissions are falling if we close our steel industry and import the stuff from China instead, where, by the way, it's even more carbon intensive than it would have been if we produced the steel here. It's carbon consumption, what you and I consume, the pollution that's involved in what you and I do, not carbon production that counts. So just look back since, I don't know, the election last year. We're effectively closing Grangemouth, the largest refinery in the UK, I think, and turning it into an import facility. All those emissions overseas rather than here. Closed the refinery in Scotland, Exxon's refinery in Scotland. We closed a refinery in Hull, one of the two. We've closed most of the steel industry. We've closed the fertilizer industry. We've closed the fiberglass industry. And the car industry touched its 1948 production level recently. It's now back to about 1952. These are just indicators and rapid indicators of what happens when you have the highest industrial electricity prices virtually in the world, and you have demanding domestic carbon territorial emissions targets, but you're open to import the stuff instead. We are digging a very big hole, and the tragedy is that most people think we're digging this hole for good purpose, and actually we're achieving remarkably little. Put it another way around, had we used the same amount of money and resources to pay for carbon emission reductions in some of the fast developing countries, it would have made a hell of a lot more difference to climate change, that global phenomena. You know, Indonesia, rapidly growing economy. India, rapidly growing economy, both very coal-based. China, overwhelmingly coal-based for all the talk of renewables and so on. Nigeria, population to double by 2050, be more people in Nigeria than the whole of the EU by 2050. This is where climate change will be determined, like it or not. It will not be determined in Oxford or Hampshire or in Scotland. So if you care about climate change and you think it's really urgent, you might even think it's an emergency. I think that's stretching the term quite a lot. But if you think it is, then let's deal with the problem. Let's go and address where the fire's burning most hotly instead of trying to do peripheral stuff and pretend we're making a difference. So if you now look forward and see how we've created this hole we're digging, first of all, put context again in place. We are facing a potentially major increase in the demand for energy. We're not decoupling growth from energy. We're about to embark on some of the most energy intensive investments the world has ever seen. That's called data centers, AI, quantum computing, fiber, broadband, all that stuff. The new economies that we're building around the world are energy intensive, and they don't want intermittent generation. They want it 24/7. They want it really secure. And already it's obvious that the data centers plan for the UK, were they to go ahead, would just break straight through our territorial carbon targets. So a lot of demand's coming. Now, we should have the right target. Carbon consumption, global warming is what we should focus on. Now, you might think, well, anyway, okay, isn't there a transition going on? Aren't all these wind turbines and solar panels transforming our energy world? Well, yes and no. If you think that the demand for energy is going to double by 2050, and you think about how many wind turbines and solar panels you could put, I mean, why not cover all the agricultural land in Britain? Would it make a transition? And the answer is no, because if the world economy grows at, say, 3% per annum, which will be pretty low, then it will be twice its current size in 2050. That's 2 world economies in 25 years' time. What the renewables are doing is taking up some of the additional growth in the demand for energy. There is no transition at all. We will be burning as much oil, probably as much coal, and more gas in 2050 than we are now, and we will have a great deal of renewables. In fact, there never has been an energy transition. When we went from wood to coal, the demand for wood increased. We burn more wood now than we've ever done globally for energy. When we went from coal to oil, the coal demand went up, not down. When gas came along, the oil demand carried on going up, and so on. What the new technologies, and they're not that new now anymore, but wind and solar do, is add to our energy supply against a growing demand. No transition at all. They just take up some of the new demand while the existing whole economy and quite a lot of the new economy remains in fossil fuels. Now, the next bit is really important. There is no such thing as clean energy. There are cleaner energies and there are dirtier energies. You really have to struggle to find anything that's dirtier than all that coal that's being burnt in China. Gas is a lot cleaner than coal. It might be cleaner than oil, but we can, reasonable people can disagree about that. Drax certainly isn't cleaner. And when you come to wind and solar, well, aren't they clean energy? Well, take a breather and have a look at what the supply chains are that go into your EV, your solar panel, and your wind turbine. Look at where it's made. 80% of solar panels, by the way, are made in China. Quite a lot of the rest are made in China and assembled in places like Europe. The magnets in the wind turbines, the turbine itself, the steel, the blades, etc., much of that's made overseas. And those magnets require rare earths. And the batteries, which are essential to back up the wind and the solar and for your car, well, that's nickel, cobalt, copper, and so on, lithium. And go and have a look at Google Earth and have a look at the cobalt mine in the Congo, or have a look at the great lithium mines in the Golden Lithium Triangle in Latin America, and just see, or look in China's rare earth mines from space, from Google Earth, and you will see just how devastating producing that stuff is, how energy intensive, how dirty it is, how actually awful it is for child labour, human rights, and so on. And then think about all the effort and energy and pollution that goes into refining this stuff into a state that can be then put into your battery, and then you can drive it around, certainly if you're on the local council where I am, with big signs saying that you're a zero emission vehicle. If only. It's not true. Okay? It's much harder to think about how to have energy without emissions than it seems flippantly to say there's clean energy and there's dirty energy. Fossil fuels here, lovely EVs over here. No, It's not like that at all. It's shades of grey, shades of dirty, shades of clean. And those supply chains really matter. And those supply chains and all the pollution in them are what lies behind you or me sitting in our EV and driving around and pretending to be environmentally virtuous. That's not against having an EV, by the way. I've got one. It's not against solar. It's not against wind. It's just being brutally realistic about what actually is involved in producing this stuff. There are no easy get out of jail cards. No one's going to come up with an invention in the next 10 years to crack the problem. Fusion's a long way off, and so on and so forth. And offsets, well, there is a case for offsets in certain circumstances, but paying someone else to sequestrate carbon so you can go on polluting is hardly the way in which we're going to crack this problem. We need sequestration and emissions reduction, not either or, and quite a lot of indulgences, because that's what offsets are, well, exactly that. They really don't achieve very much. You get on an aeroplane and fly around the world, and you tick the box and you buy, put some money aside for a carbon offset to plant some eucalyptus plantation somewhere. I'm being a bit flippant, but you can see what I'm getting at. You know, that isn't really offsetting climate change. That's allowing you to carry on your polluting lifestyle and get somebody else to try to mop up the consequences of doing that. It won't wash. Okay, so if we look at where we're going, it's no surprise whatsoever to me that the UK leads the leaderboard at the reduction of territorial carbon emissions, has amounts to the most expensive electricity, certainly industrial electricity in the world, is deindustrializing fast and making virtually no difference to climate change at all. And in the process, it is engaged in some stuff in the name of climate change, which is industrializing the countryside and actually making the countryside contribute less to biodiversity and less to all those things that we value. It's one thing to say we have to sacrifice our countryside for solar farms and so on because we're going to address climate change. It's another thing to say we have to sacrifice all this, and by the way, it won't make any difference, or virtually none. And remember, the sun doesn't shine very much in winter. It isn't a solution like a nuclear power station is, which is always on firm power. That's not to say we should necessarily build nukes or not build nukes, or that we shouldn't build solar panels, but it is to think carefully about where the balance is. Where the win-wins really lie is in agriculture and our landscape. Agriculture is proportionately, it's only about 0.5% of GDP, a much bigger polluter than any other industry in the UK. It's about 11-12% of emissions as currently measured, but of course we don't really measure the emissions that come from modern intensive agriculture, from the soils and so on properly. So that's probably more like 15%. Well, the whole electricity industry is only about 19%, and that's a lot more than 0.5% of GDP. So we have an agriculture that produces very little of total value. Once you net out the subsidies, it's pretty close to zero. It's not to say that farming isn't a good thing or we shouldn't be doing farming. It's simply to be realistic about what's going on. And therefore, because it's actually not that economically significant, it's cheaper to address emissions by going head on to agriculture and the soils than it is in some of the other areas of our economy. And think about it. So, soil has roughly, it's a kind of ballpark number, about 4 times the carbon of the atmosphere. It's the great carbon sink of our planet. And we're ripping it up and emitting the carbon from it. And we're intensifying agriculture, and we're clearing more rainforests, more natural environment for this purpose. Recall my mention of the Indonesian army helping to clear the rainforest for modern agriculture. This is a lose-lose game. And we here in the UK should not be playing to that game. Because whereas global warming is global, a lot of our biodiversity is local, and so is our landscape, and so are all the things we hold precious. Now, if we can improve the biodiversity of our landscape, if we can improve our natural environment, if we can increase sequestration in the process and get all the other natural capital benefits, that's a much better way of contributing to the local and the global possibilities. So what should we do? Well, here it gets really, really local. I look at the river outside my home office, it's the Evenlode, and I can see the muck in it. I can see its dirty colour, and that's not hard to explain because just up the road there's a sewer that keeps chucking out sewage into this river. The riverbanks, there are areas where they've been ploughed almost to the riverbanks. When it rains really hard and it floods, you can see the soil go into the river. That's all carbon going into the river. Now, what could you do with this? Well, the scope for improvement is massive. The opportunities are enormous. For a start, why don't we plant the banks with alder and willows and deciduous broadleafed trees which are native to our area? Why don't we have a bank along the river? In fact, why don't we have a bank of deciduous native trees along every single bank of every single river in Britain as the default position? I exaggerate. But imagine if you had that. You would shade the river. You would cool the water. You would mitigate some of the effects of what climate change is doing to the temperature in that river. You would hold back the silt that's coming off the fields. You'd hold back the carbon-intensive fertilizers, the nutrients that are going in to do so much damage to our rivers. And you'd create a wonderful space for people to walk the river banks, to take their kids. And yeah, you know what? The kids could actually jump in the river and not fear for their health as a consequence. Is that too much to ask? Is that too difficult? And of course, it's very, very carbon positive because those trees are going to sequestrate some carbon. So really local, really close to us, things we can do make a difference. But on the other hand, do we really need to march pylons all over the landscape? Do we really need to cover swathes of agricultural land with solar farms? No, we don't. But we are where we are, and we have a lot of them. And it's pretty reasonable to say, given how much offshore and onshore wind we have, and how much solar farms and solar contributions already built, we've probably got enough. It's not a case of ripping them out. It's a case of saying, do you want even more? And in the positive frame of this too, you know, when it comes to solar, why don't we just cover all the rooftops with the stuff? Factories, buildings, etc. I mean, some are, but we could do a great deal more. You don't have to take a beautiful view, a beautiful bit of countryside, a prime piece of agricultural land, and shove it full of shiny solar panels to get a solar effect. There are lots of other ways of getting the same position, and so on. And it becomes very detailed, very local, very specific. Similarly, it matters where new houses are built. Houses are amazingly carbon intensive. There's no such thing as a zero carbon house, right? Think how the bricks are made. Think where the breeze blocks come from. Think where the cement comes. By the way, at least 30% is now imported because it's so expensive to produce the stuff in Britain, given our electricity prices. Think of the timber. Think of all the things that go into a house. Right? And you know, this is not carbon neutral. This is not zero emission stuff. This is contributing to climate change. But, you know, new houses are needed in various places until the population starts to decline on the same pace as Europe and then accelerates going forward. And if we do that, well, fine. Let's put them in the right place. let's be sensitive to their climate impact, and let's think very hard about how they integrate into the landscape. The case for building in cities is enormous. It's vastly environmentally better than building in the countryside. And it's better for lots of the people too. Just think about how much emissions there are from relatively dense urban housing, and then from standalone executive houses dotted all over the green belt, because builders would probably prefer to build on the green belt than they would to build social housing in cities. Again, we can do so much better. So if you think about what we're doing and where we're going, the starting point for any climate change policy is to stop digging ever deeper holes. Focus on the questions that matter. It's global. Let's make sure our contribution is global. Don't kid ourselves about territorial domestic emissions when our carbon consumption just keeps marching up. Let's focus on the areas where at home we can make a difference. You and I can make a difference personally. You could stop flying, for example. There are lots of things we could do individually, but there's also what we can do with our country, with our land, with our agriculture, with our rivers, with all the things that happen to make this place still a beautiful place to live, and still with an environment that's worth saving and worth doing a lot to preserve and enhance, so we give the next generation a decent countryside fit for them to choose how to live their lives, environmentally vibrant, with biodiversity, with open spaces, with recovered rivers, with riverbanks that work for people, with pollution limited, and in the process, by the way, with less of a carbon imprint than we have at the moment. Thank you.